This week we're going to take another look at something we actually looked at quite a while ago, which is SignalR. And what I was originally planning on doing was showing you how to write a SignalR client in WPF. But when I looked back at the last video, I realised I hadn't even shown you how to do a client in Blazor. I'd done a basic JavaScript client and also one in Angular, but nothing in Blazor, also nothing in React. If you're interested, let me know, I can show you React. But what we're going to do this week is show you how to make this all work with a client written in Blazor. Let's just do a quick recap. I'm not going to recap lots of stuff here. Look at the old video for the details, but I'll just show what's going on. So if I run up the application, and then I'm going to drag over the browser window, and the point of this, it's an interactive way of communicating. So I'm going to get hold of the URL there, and then bring up another window, paste it in there, and then let's just place these side by side on the same screen. And so what I can now do is let's in there enter one player's name. That switches to a mode of waiting for another player to connect. Over here, we do the other player's name, connect there, and then we're in the game mode. So we can see it's Harry versus Sally. Harry is going to click rock, waiting for Sally. Sally's going to click paper, and then we see paper beats rock, and so we get the results there. So that's all we had last time. And the way that worked was we had the SignalR Hub. So that was the game hub here that was doing the real logic of that and getting the communication between the two clients via the hub. And then the client itself was just a MVC view generating some HTML. And then the actual logic on the client side was very primitive. It was just this game.js, so plain old JavaScript, to make the whole thing work. And so it's basically those two things, the HTML and the JavaScript, that we're going to replace with Blazor. So let's get on with that. So I'm going to add a new project into here, and we'll just go for a Blazor WebAssembly standalone project. I'm going to call this Blazor Client. And then we'll stick with .NET 9, and I'm going to include the sample pages. Not that I really need much of them, but I do want to have Bootstrap in here just to get the styling right, and that gives me Bootstrap. So if I click Create on that, that will then give me our Blazor Client project, and the immediate first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of counter, and I'm going to get rid of weather. I'm also going to get rid of nav menu, and in the layout I'm just going to get rid of the nav menu there as well. So we've just got that basic home page, which is where I'm going to put all of my stuff. Another thing we need to do is make this multiple startups. So if I go to the solution and go for configure startup projects, just while we're here, it's worth noting there's a new feature that came into Visual Studio a while back, about the time that .NET 9 came out, but it's a really nice one on multiple startup projects, because it used to be you could choose your multiple startup projects. So here I want both the SignalR and the Blazor to start, but you couldn't choose the configuration they started in. So whether it's SignalR, IS Express, whatever, that's the things that are listed here when we decide how we're going to start it, which relate to actually what's in here in the launch settings for the various ways we can launch something. And it used to be, if you went to multiple startup, it would use for that particular project the profile that you'd used previously, which is very irritating if you wanted to have different profiles. So that's what we've got now, much nicer. We can, in that multiple startup, as well as having them starting, we can, if we want to, I'm not going to bother here because I do just want the default, but we can choose a different profile to start up. So when we do that, that means we'll just start up both the client and the server. Now let's get on and do something with that. So what I want to do is go to the MVC view that we had here and just steal most of that, because that's going to be the basis that we have for our home component. So if we go in home here, and let's just replace all of that with that. And the other thing I'm going to do is just, again, from the original site CSS, I've just got a couple of bits of CSS, and so I'll just put them straight into the app.css. I should probably use CSS isolation with Blazor, but that's not what we're talking about here, so I'll just keep it simple and throw it straight into there. And then let's run that up. And we can see there we've got the original MVC, and then if I drag it over, here we've got the Blazor. And what we can see is it's not perfect so far, because at the moment we've got everything out there. So we've got the welcome and enter your name, and we've got the waiting, and we've got the playing. Those are really three different phases that we want to go through. So that's what I'm going to put in first. So let's close that down. And then on our home.razor, I'm going to put in a code section. And then the first thing we're going to do is have a enum. So we're going to have a private enum called phase, and we're going to have 3 phases, which are either the welcome phase or the waiting phase or the playing phase. So that will take us through those 3 steps. And then that's obviously just a type. So now we're going to have a private phase that I'll call _phase, and we'll initialize it to welcome, which is what we first wanted to see. And then to divide that up, we can see those 3 divs basically are those 3 different sections we have. So I'm going to do an @switch on our phase, and then if we have a case of phase.welcome, then we have that code going in there, and we've got to put a break because it's just a C# switch, so it obeys those rules. Then we'll have a case of phase.waiting, and in there we'll just put that div for the waiting and a break again. And then finally we'll have a case of phase.playing, and that should be the rest of the code there. Not actually going to use that error, so I'll get rid of that. Still need a break, even though that's the last one. And so that should be all of that. And what I'm also going to do, these IDs, for the most part, are really only necessary when we were writing the JavaScript that needed to manipulate the DOM through the ID. So I'm going to get rid of that and get rid of that. I'm not actually going to get rid of this RPS welcome, RPS just rock, paper, scissors, because I did use that, because we can see we're using it there for some CSS. So that one, although again, if we used CSS isolation, we could probably make that tidier. That's what we need to do there. So that's put the basic code in there, and it should now mean that it starts out as welcome, and then we're going to have to put some code in to move it through the other phases. And so the first thing that happens is we have the ability to put in your name and then press the button to register your name. So things that we're going to do here. Firstly, we're going to have a field to store that name. So in here, I'm going to have a private string, and we'll call this _player name, initialize it to blank, and then we're going to put on the input, we'll have an @bind value, and then that we can bind onto our _player name. The other thing I want to do here, because we're going to have disabling of the button, we want it to respond instantly when we press a key, not when we tab out. So we have to change that bind value, and then we can say :event, and we set that to on input, and that means that every time we do a keystroke, the value of player name will be updated. Then this disabled, we want to, in there, we want to say disabled equals, and then we're going to do an @string.is null or white space on the player name. So that means that if the player name is blank, then it'll be disabled. But as soon as we hit a keystroke, because it's done the event as on input, it will change immediately. Okay, and then we've got to have some functionality when we click that button. So in here, we're going to put our first method. So it's going to be a private async task, and then we'll call it register. And then we will just on the button say @on click equals, and then just call that register. Okay, and now of course we need to start putting in some SignalR, because we're going to make a SignalR call with what we do there. So first thing we've got to do is onto our project, we are going to add a NuGet package, and this is going to be a ASP.NET Core SignalR.client. So this is what goes into the client side, not what goes in the hub. That's different, obviously. But we put that in there, we'll install that. And now back in our home, in here, I'm going to have a private, and then we've got this thing called a hub connection, which comes from that package we just put in there. So we pick up the using, and we'll just call this _hub connection. And that actually needs to be nullable because we can't initialize it straight away. We initialize it in the on init async. So we'll do an override of on initialized async, make that itself async, and we'll await that. And then we've got to put this hub together. And what we do is we say _hub connection equals, and then we do this through a thing called a hub connection builder. So we say new hub connection builder, And then on this we can provide lots and lots of different options, but the main one we're interested in is this thing called .with URL, because that is what specifies the location of the hub on the server that we're going to talk back to. And we can get hold of that because if we go back to our SignalR server and look in Properties, Launch Settings, and there we can see the profile that we're using. So localhost 7234. Obviously we should really be doing this through a config file, but just to keep it simple, we've got that. But then the other thing we've got to do is if again we look on the hub and look in the program, we can see down here that it's mapped to Game Hub. So as well as the address of the actual server, you've got to have whatever you'd mapped that onto, so Game Hub there. And then finally, because that's a connection builder, we've got to build a connection, so we say .build, and whatever config we've put in there, that puts it all together, and that gives us our hub connection. But although we've got the connection, we haven't yet connected to the server. So the last thing we have to do is we say underscore hub connection dot start async, and as the name suggests, that is asynchronous, so we're doing await there. So that will actually now make the connection back to the hub. And that means now in our register, we can start doing useful things. So what we're going to do here is we've firstly just got to check we've got a hub connection, because remember it's nullable, so it won't be happy if we don't have that. So we'll say if hub connection does not equal null. And then all we need to do here is say await hub connection dot send async. And then what are we going to send? Well, we can find that out if we look at the hub itself. So there's our hub. And the methods we have on the hub, you can see, are the things that can come from the client. And we've got register, which takes a parameter of name. So that's what we want to send. So what we do is first parameter to send async is the name of the method that we're sending, so register. And then subsequent parameters, however many there may be, is going to be the information we send, which we said was our name, which we know because we did data binding goes into player name. So that's all that we need to do there, and that will send off the message. But then you can see again, if you look at the hub, what happens is it will then send back either a game started or a waiting for player. So if you're the first player in, you get a waiting for player. If you're the second player in, it'll hook the two of you up and we get a game started. So we now need to respond, well, to both of those, but we'll start with waiting for player. And so the way we do that is back where we're creating the connection, after we've created it, but before we start it, because otherwise you might miss messages, we start doing underscore hub connection dot on. And then what we do here is once again, we make use of the name of the message, which in this case is waiting for player. No parameters, you'll notice there. So that means we do waiting for player. And then we can just have no parameters on a lambda. And then the lambda is going to be what gets executed when that request comes in. And all we need to do with this one is move the game on to the next phase. So we simply are going to say underscore phase equals, and then we'll have phase.waiting. Now, something you have to watch out for here, whenever you're responding to these messages coming in from the SignalR Hub, Blazor itself is unaware that anything is happening, and it doesn't realize that you have changed the state by changing phase, and that it therefore needs to do a re-render. So this is one of those situations where you need to call state has changed, which comes from the component base class, just to tell the system to do a refresh to redisplay the screen. But we can run that up just to see if it's working, because that will give us enough to see that we've got the connection. Because remember, we don't move on to that next phase until we've had the message back from the hub. So that will show we've got a round trip in terms of communication. So this is our Blazor Hub. You can see at the moment the button's disabled. If I start typing, you can see it becomes enabled. And if I click enter, we move on to the next phase. And that proves that we've done a round trip to the hub. So next thing we need to do is respond to that other message we had there, which remember was the game started. So let's just copy that. And that one, you'll notice, takes a number of parameters. We've got the name of the first player, the name of the second player, and also an identifier of the group, because this can actually play multiple games with multiple pairs. So let's do a similar sort of thing. Probably in a real application, it might be better to separate this out rather than just having it all in uninitialized async, but it shows the principles here, so I think this is probably the best way to do it to get started. So let's paste in that game started, and then our lambda is going to take 3 parameters, and it's got to be typed parameters because the lambda can't infer it in this case because we don't really know what we're getting as static types from SignalR. So we're going to have string player 1, string player 2, and string game ID. And then again, let's give that a body. And then what are we going to do with all of that? Well, first thing we can do is we can change the phase to playing, because we've now got 2 players, so we should be there. Then we're also going to store both that game ID and the opponent name. So what I'm going to do is on here, as well as the player name, I'm going to have an opponent name, and I'm also going to have a game ID. And so simply enough, when we go to playing, we can also say underscore game ID equals game ID. And then for the player name, it's a little bit tricky because those player 1 and player 2, we don't really know which one is us and which one is the other player. So what we have to do is say underscore opponent name equals, and then player 1 equals underscore player name. So if we're player 1, then the opponent must be player 2. Otherwise, the opponent must be player 1. So that just works it out. And then once again, we've got to follow that on with a state has changed. We're going to have to do that in all of these. One last thing I've got to do, having set up that opponent name, I've also got to put that into the things we've got here. So here we can see you are playing against, and previously, because of the way it worked with JavaScript, it had a span, but I can in here now simply just say at underscore opponent name, and that will display the opponent name straight in there. So if we now run that, and there you can see we've got on the right the original MVC, and on the left we've got the Blazor. We could play Blazor versus Blazor, but simply enough we've got the both of them. They work through the same hub, so that'll be fine. So if I in here put Harry, and we go to waiting for another player to connect, if I in there put Sally, and then enter that, then we can see you're playing against Sally, you're playing against Harry, so we're ready to continue and actually play the game. And at the moment, it still obviously works on the MVC, but we're not going to get anything on the Blazor as yet. So that's the next thing we've got to do. So what we've got to do now is allow us to press our buttons. So you can see we've got here these 3 buttons. And again, we don't need IDs on these because that was when we were using JavaScript to manipulate them. We're going to be manipulating them just using Blazor, which is much simpler. So that's what we put in there. And what I'm going to do is put in a function. So we're going to have another private async task, which we're going to call throw hand. So throwing is just the term that's used for making a sign of rock, paper, scissors. And then we'll have a string that we'll call selection, which is going to be actually what was chosen, rock or paper or scissors. And then once again, we will check to see if we've got a hub connection, even though we couldn't really get this far if we hadn't, but it's just got to be there for the nullable references. And then I'm also actually going to store another string. And this one I'm going to call selection. Again, initialize that to null. And so that is going to be just storing the selection so we can remember what it was called. And then we're going to do an await on underscore hub connection dot send async. And then what we need to send here, if we go back and take another look at the hub, this is going to be the throw, and it takes 3 parameters. The group name, we call it group ID, the player that's making the selection, and what the selection was. So that means in here, we've got to have the message, as we said, is just called throw. Then the group name we saw was just underscore game ID. Then the player is going to be underscore player name, so it's us. And then the selection is what we've just got in there. And so that should get things working. What we're also going to do though is hook that up on those buttons. So on the rock button, we're going to say, well, actually we can do this mostly on all of them. Just use an Alt select to select multiple rows, and we're going to do @on click equals, and then we'll open quotes, and we're going to say empty parameter lambda gives, and then throw hand, and then we'll pass in, well, I'll start out just doing rock for all of them. So that should set all that up. Notice I've used single quotes there so they don't get confused with the double quotes in the C#. And then I can just change that to paper and that one to scissors, so that'll pass the right ones through. The other thing we want to do though, I said we want to remember what the selection was, and basically want to in some way highlight the button that has that selection. And that was one of the things we put in the CSS. We've got this RPS highlight class. So what we need to do on these as well is, again, we can do it on all of them and make some changes. I'm going to say class equals, and then I'm going to say @ and then put in some brackets just so it knows where it is. And then we're going to say underscore selection, double equals, and then again we'll start with rock, but we'll change this for the other ones. And if it's rock, then we're going to use that RPS dash highlight colon, we're just going to have blank, and then close the round bracket and close the quote. And then again, we're just going to change that to paper and that to scissors. So that means when we set the selection down there, it should leave that one highlighted. And let's just run that to check it. And so we can see if again we log in as Harry, log in as Sally, and then if I say click rock on there, you can see it's got that slight highlighting while we're waiting. You can see that Sally has been told that I've made a selection, so we're waiting for Sally. And then if I click paper there, we can see paper beats rock, and so Sally's won. So it's all working, except we're not picking up that information back on the Blazor because we've got a little bit more to do. And if we take a look at the hub once again, we can see that the things that we have to do here, what happens with a throw, well, it's going to send a pending, which is when we're waiting for the other player to play, and then ultimately it's either going to send a drawn or a won, depending on the circumstances. So let's do that first one first and do the pending. So let's do that in here. So back in here, we're going to do underscore hub connection dot on, and again, let's get that pending, and you can see all it does is tells you who you're waiting for. So we'll paste that in there, and then this is going to be a lambda string of waiting for, and once again, just give that a body. Now bear in mind, this message gets sent out both when we've clicked and they haven't, and when they've clicked and we haven't. And that's why we've got the waiting for to determine which one we're waiting for. So we're going to have to do a different message depending on what comes in there. So what we're going to do actually is onto the private members, I'm going to put another private string, and this one I'm going to call underscore message 1, and again initialize it to blank. I'm going to do another one called message 2, and although I'm not going to use it immediately, I'll put it in now. We're going to have another one called scores. And you can see that back up here in the code that we copied, we've got these 3 paragraphs for precisely that purpose. But once again, they don't need the IDs. So we can just put in here @underscore message 1, @underscore message 2, and @underscore scores. So that will bind that all in there. Again, using binding rather than direct manipulation like we had with the JavaScript. And so what we're going to do in the pending now is we're going to say underscore message 1 is going to be underscore player name equals waiting for. So if we're waiting for ourselves, that means the other player has clicked. So what we'll put in there is your opponent has chosen. Whereas if it's the other player we're waiting for, we have a different message. We're going to say waiting for, and then just waiting for. Okay, so that will set our message 1. Our message 2 in this case, we're going to leave as complete blank. There's nothing there. We'll see later on what goes in message 2, but let's just put that in there. And then, of course, the last thing we've got to do, as with all of them, is do the status changed. So if we run that up, just to check it's working that far, and we'll put in Harry and Sally, and then if I select rock, we've got your opponent is chosen, and we've got waiting for Sally there, and obviously we can do that. Or if I select on Sally's side first, scissors, your opponent is chosen, and then when I do something, we don't get the final result, of course, because we haven't got that far. But we're getting through there. So next thing to do is respond to those final 2 messages, which were the drawn and the won. So let's once again just take that existing one, paste that in there, tidy it up a little bit, and then we'll change this to drawn. If we take a quick look at the Game Hub, we'll see that when we have a drawn, we get 2 parameters, explanation and scores. So we're here going to have a string explanation and then a string which is going to be scores. And then what we're going to do is message 1 is going to be simply drawn. Message 2 is going to be the explanation, and we'll put that just so it matches up with what we had before. The explanation actually goes in brackets. And then we can simply set the scores to being the scores. And then one thing we've got to remember to do there, remember this selection that we set when we click the button, well, that can be cleared now because we've finished that round. So we can just say underscore selection equals blank, and then we can have the status change once again. So that's the drawn. Now let's do similar sort of thing for the won. So we'll change that to 1. Again, let's check what's happening on the hub. And on the hub, as well as the explanation and the scores, we've also got the name of the winner, because it could be them or it could be us. So we'll say string winner. So 3 parameters there. And then what we're going to do, message 1, that's going to be different depending on who won. So we're going to say winner equals player name. So that's us. So if it's us, we just say you won. If it's not us, then we say winner won. Okay, so that will show who won. We still want to display the explanation. We still want to display the scores. We still want to clear the selection. We still want to do the status change. So that really should now be doing everything. So if we run that up, and there we can see the 2 of them. And so if we put in Harry there and Sally there, and let's click rock, it's highlighted. We can see the 2 messages. Let's go for rock there as well. And we can see it's drawn, draw, should get those to match up, it doesn't matter. And then we have the explanation, rock draws with rock draws with rock, and then we've got the overall score. If we go again, so scissors and rock again, this time you won, or Harry won, depending which you're looking at. It's got the explanation and it's got what's going on. If we go for paper and scissors, then we've got the same thing again. And so we can see that's all working very well. The logic of the game is exactly the same as before. That's all happening in the SignalR Hub on the server. But we've got, in this case, 2 different types of client. We've got an MVC client plus JavaScript, or we've got a Blazor client. If I wanted to, let's copy that and paste it into there. So now we've got 2 Blazor clients. Got to refresh it so we get a new game. But if we put Sally in that one and Harry in that one, then you can see we can now play Blazor versus Blazor. So doesn't matter at all what the end technology is. It's all going through the same SignalR Hub. And we could have included the game version that I had in Angular that I mentioned, and that would still work in exactly the same way. So that's what we've got there. Just an example of how we can have a SignalR client written in Blazor and running just seamlessly with any other client. Next time, I'm going to take a look at how to do that in WPF, which will be pretty similar, but we'll see some issues there. And then the following week, we're going to see how all of these things we've been looking at over the last few videos fit together. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.